Healing the Eternal Soul is a book sprinkled with case examples that makes it an invaluable resource for those who assist others in achieving contact with their eternal part. It lends hope to those whose lives are stuck or riddled with painful residuals from past lives. More so, it's an incredibly interesting read.
The Past Life Regression Academy teaches hypnosis, past life regression, regression therapy, and life between lives regression internationally. Hundreds of students have been through the Academy training program and have successful practices. This is because of the amazing results they get and the referrals that come from it. For more information, see the Regression Academy website.
Hello, welcome to the Spiritual Regression Show with Rena on moretalk.tv. I'm Rena and I'm the Director of Divine Aspect, a therapy practice based in Dorset, UK, focusing on life coaching, regression therapy, life between life therapy, and hypnotherapy. I'm also the trainer for the Past Life Regression Academy in the UK and the US. Spiritual emergency is a relatively untold story that so many people go through. It is an intense experience, and when those who are going through it do not understand the state, it causes so much discomfort and fear. I'm so happy to be here today with two experts in the field, Catherine Lucas and Janet Trelaw, who can tell us more about spiritual emergency. Catherine is the author of In Case of Spiritual Emergency, Moving Successfully Through Your Awakening. Catherine is the founder of the Spiritual Crisis Network based in UK and Canada. She is also a mindfulness trainer and has been training groups since 2007. Her latest book, Coping with Mental Health Crisis, 7 Steps to Healing, is out in September 2015. Janet is also a trainer for the Past Life Regression Academy. As a teenager, she experienced her own spiritual emergency, which has led to a passion to help those undergoing energy crises. A qualified spiritual healer, spirit release practitioner, regression therapist, and hypnotherapist, Janet has developed techniques and protocols for assisting clients experiencing spiritual emergency. She believes if understood and supported appropriately, spiritual emergency can be deeply transformative, offering the possibility of breakthrough rather than breakdown. Catherine and Janet, thank you for coming onto the show and welcome. Catherine and Janet, I know that both of you have had personal experience with spiritual emergency. Maybe Catherine, you could start by telling us what your personal journey was.
Sure, and thank you for inviting me on the show, Rena. It's good to be here. So, well, my journey started a long time ago when I was 20. I ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a month. Now, that needs, to be put in context a little bit, in that I come from quite a wounded, dysfunctional family in many ways. My father was an alcoholic. And in fact, the time when I ended up in hospital was when my parents were actually splitting up. So there was kind of a whole context for what happened. Now I should also mention that my family had no kind of spiritual awareness or understanding. Very much a kind of secular family, very typical average kind of family, really. So when I ended up in hospital, there was no appreciation that this could be some sort of a healing process or healing journey. Basically, there was this kind of illness label. I'd had a breakdown. I was ill. There was something wrong with me. All that kind of that was the response. That was the approach. Now, yeah.
I was going to say. So, what led you to the point of breakdown? What did you see about yourself, some of the symptoms you were experiencing?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, actually, because when I look back now and I see the sorts of things that were going on, I can see that it was the beginning of my awakening, the beginning of the spiritual emergence and emergency. So let me give you an example. At one point, I stood on the windowsill. This is on the ground floor, fortunately, but I stood on the windowsill, and I had a sense that I could fly. Now, what I was in touch with was the part of us that can move through time and space. Okay, our soul, our spirit that isn't constrained by the physical body. Looking back now, I can understand that, but of course, nobody around me had that sort of appreciation or understanding. So those are and also there was also some past life material starting to kind of bleed through that was quite distressing, and I'd never even heard of past lives, without. So it's very difficult to kind of make sense of these things. For me, when I had no spiritual frame of reference or context within which to understand it. Now, if we kind of fast forward to about 20 years later, 2003, I went on a trip to Egypt with my then spiritual teacher. A group of us went there. And by this time, I had very much embarked upon my journey. I'd been meditating for quite a few years. I'd been in a very kind of very conscious way engaging in on my spiritual path. So we've got a very different set of circumstances, a very different context, if you like. Now, I was only in Egypt for a week, but it was a phenomenally intense time. And I actually ended up in a wheelchair for a few days because what I went through was so extreme emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, that basically my body went into shock. And I couldn't even sort of walk, sort of, get out of bed to go to the loo kind of thing. So this, I thought it was quite an ingenious solution, actually, the wheelchair. And I ended up traveling back to the UK in a wheelchair. It was quite a palaver. Anyway, we don't need to go into that amount of detail, but I then started organizing, because I'd been so well supported during that, and the aftermath of it. I then organized the first conference on spiritual emergency and started, and that's where I then started really kind of engaging with trying to raise awareness and understanding of this process. That was the first conference, and from the first conference, the Spiritual Crisis Network came, and we can talk more about that later. And yeah, the whole starting to kind of really put some of this out into the world. And then ended up in crisis again in 2006. And this time it was even more intense, if that. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to believe just the sheer intensity of these experiences. This time, the peak of the crisis lasted a whole month. Which that's a long time to have that amount of adrenaline and fear pumping through your body, and that, yeah, I sort of ended up traveling to Italy because that was where I kind of felt safe. I had a connection with an Italian spiritual teacher, and then so that was a sort of the next step, if you like, which then also needed integrating and processing. And these experiences take a long time to process and integrate. And I suppose the sort of kind of the outcome of that, in a sense, was then my book, In Case of Spiritual Emergency, which was published in 2011. So that's kind of the process kind of unfolding in me, or through me, if you like.
Yeah. Wow, that must have been really intense, Catherine. And Janet, can you just share what your experience was with spiritual emergency?
Yes, certainly. Mine is quite a different route, as it were. When I was younger, especially when I was very, very young, I had a lot of very intense paranormal experiences. And these really started right from the beginning of my life. My earliest memories are of what we would deem now as ghosts, but that I could see just as clear as I'm seeing somebody live and well. And they were initially very friendly and would look after me quite a bit when nobody else was around. But as I grew up, the experiences started to change a bit. As Catherine said, I also came from a family which wasn't necessarily aware or open to this. We were a typical English family with a Church of England background, so not particularly religious, but that was really where my parents' ideas on all of this would have stemmed from. I know now that my parents were confused and worried what I was talking about when it became obvious as I got older that I wasn't just talking and just pretending that people were there, but I really was talking to people. And that when I was talking about certain family members that I didn't know that had died way before, that I was talking about certain people, and there was a truth in this rather than just an imagination. But as I got older, there was a number of different situations that were happening. But again, to myself looking back, I think there was a very high energy spot where I was living, which can affect things. I was near to a railway line and a number of other things that were going on. And it was quite stressful at home. I didn't have, at that time, a particularly good relationship with my father. And eventually, what happened over the years, where it was dealt with in a way of if we just ignore it and we pretend it's not going on, it'll go away. For me as a child, it became very confusing because I was often told to stop making anything up and stop saying the things that I was saying. And eventually, what happened, my schoolwork was horrendous. My concentration levels were all over the place. And by the time I was about 8 or 9, physically, I had a lot of eczema covering me, skin disorders. I was pulling out all my eyelashes, and I was probably, to the outside world, a very shy, very introverted child. The paranormal experiences were constantly going on at home, but they'd morphed into a very dark area. It was very confusing and scary for me. There was a particular time when I was trying to ignore, I'll just call them ghosts for now, for want of a better word, but there were children around, ghost children, that wanted to play with me. And where I was trying to ignore them and focus on my family, they pushed me down the stairs. And so I was quite fearful of things that were happening. I didn't really have anywhere to turn. And again, a number of experiences, it ended up becoming quite, I was getting a lot of premonitions and then seeing on the news a few days later exactly what I'd seen a few nights before. And often people were injured. I remember very vividly a helicopter crash, which was particularly awful to see because I could see the two guys that were in it and that died in it. And then when I saw it on the news, and I was probably about 10 maybe at that point, and I knew that I had seen that while they were still alive, and I really didn't know what to do with this information. We had a few things that happened. There was evidential information coming through that I was writing down, that I was trying to work out how to broach this with my family. And it was a known problem. It was a bit like the elephant in the room. No one talked about it, but every time we tried, it would go backwards, forwards, but we didn't really get anywhere. But the time for me that this really turned into what we would consider now as a real crisis, emergency state, is these different worlds that I was seeing, the premonitions and information coming through to me, started taking on such a real form that I was starting to really not know what was reality at all. I had to keep telling myself that I was at home, I was sitting on my bed, because I'd have another world that seemingly was going on around me. And it got to a point when I wasn't too sure which was which. And eventually, what happened was one day, I look at it now that something inside me just finally shattered. And there was so much confusion and fear. And this particular day, I was just sitting in my room, probably only about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, doing my homework or reading a book. And I looked up, and there was it was as if I was in a forest of very dark trees, and I'd kept seeing this vision, but it started more further out. But now it was like I was sitting in it, and I was very, very scared. And the more I tried to focus, which used to help me on my school books or whatever I had in front of me to move away from this, it just wasn't working. And so at that point, I went downstairs, and there was only my mum in the house at that time. And I just said to her, I can't cope with this anymore. And I actually asked her there and then to, from memory, I asked for, like, there was a local mental health hospital, and I actually asked to be taken there. And luckily, very luckily for me, at that moment, she made a split decision. And where I hadn't realised, they'd been very aware of what was going on, but couldn't label it, didn't know what was happening. Rather than take me to the doctors or to a hospital, she took me to a medium that actually lived in the same road, who had told her years before that she was there waiting for me to help me. So at that time, we went to her, and that was really that day for me was the start process. And she helped to make me understand that I wasn't alone, that this wasn't something, because I really absolutely believed I was crazy, and there was definitely a lot of psychosis that was happening in there as well from that period, where it sort of leapt from an awakening to an emergency state, a crisis state, where the whole thing was very, very frightening indeed. But it took quite a long process, really. It was probably about 3 months or so for me to even start to stabilise. I wasn't actually aware. Sorry?
No, I was just going to say, so basically the two experiences between Catherine and Janet is very different, because from what I could hear, Janet basically was getting quite a lot of information from the outside, whereas Catherine was feeling quite a lot within herself. So she felt like she could fly, Catherine, and you felt, all the pain in the world was coming within you, and you could feel it. And also then you felt the oneness and the unity. So Catherine, you said after your experiences, you started the first conference on spiritual emergency. How did you know that what you were experiencing that first time was spiritual emergency? Because you did say your family, didn't have any awareness of spirituality.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I left out a vital piece of information, is that between that first experience of when I ended up in the psychiatric hospital when I was 20 and 20 years later, I had actually come across the work of Stanislav Grof. Now, it was Stanislav Grof who he and his wife together coined the term spiritual emergency. And so I embarked on a transpersonal psychotherapy training, which covered spiritual emergence and emergency. It was part of the syllabus, if you like. And so that's how I knew at that point. I mean, when I came across Grof's work, it was a huge relief to me. And in fact, I know other people who've cried tears of relief when they come across Grof's work, because I suddenly, I had known all these years, I'd known that there was something else going on, that, I had a sense that what I'd been through on some level, that there was a positive element to it, that this was there was a lot more than kind of met the eye. And so when I came across Grof, that I realised that this is what I had been through, but nobody had recognised it or identified it.
No. So what exactly is spiritual emergency?
Well, it's a process. It's a very intense process. And that's probably become clear already from what Janet and I have been saying. It's basically a process of spiritual awakening. This is the term that the Grofs came up with is a bit of a play on words. This spiritual emergence and emergency. In a sense, the emergency leads to an awakening. So it's a process of spiritual awakening. But whereas for most people, their spiritual development might be kind of gradual and kind of manageable. What happens sometimes is that the process really speeds up, and really intensifies, and that's when we tip over into crisis. So, and there can be, we've seen, there can be aspects of mystical experience in there. There can be aspects of kind of psychotic type elements. It's a very complex, it's a phenomenally complex process.
Janet, how do you see spiritual emergency?
In the same vein as Catherine was saying, certainly, in that it's very complex. I often experience it, or the people that I see, is where an awakening has almost taken a slightly different path. So instead of an awakening becoming fluid and enjoyable and full of wonderful experiences, what can happen is they can still happen, but it starts to go into an area where it suddenly feels very uncontrollable, and you can feel very confused and scared and really out of control, and you don't know the experiences that are coming in. So to me, it's often an awakening can lead for different conditions that's going on in their life or situations that are happening to an emergency, or it can be that this emergency, someone's awakening state almost jumps the usual passage of time of the awakening and just jumps immediately into this crisis state as well. And it's incredibly uncomfortable to be in that state, and it can be tricky initially for people to help you, because to the outside world, sometimes you're not making that much sense, but someone in an emergency state often always also realizes they're not making sense, and they confuse themselves what's actually happening.
Got it. So what exactly is happening when someone is in an emergency state? Because I know, Janet, you see it as someone's energies fracturing. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Certainly. For me, I look at everything with the balance of our energy system, along with the physical, the emotional, the mind, everything else that's encountered. So when we are going through an awakened state or an awakening, it's natural that our energy field is opening up, and it's also shifting through different vibrations, almost pulling in information and sending it out through different vibrational fields. So and a crisis state is often, I deem it, as when this becomes almost shattered. I see the energy around someone as very, very spiky. There isn't the same fluidity at all. And so I would experience it that someone's energy is almost pushing to what we might deem as the higher realms and downloading really intense and high and pure information. But at the same time, because it's so uncontrolled, it's also pushing out in other different directions. And there you can feel these very, very strong and dark information, but also the other experiences that come and connect with all different things. So for me, it's like a shattering, a fracturing. And I keep that in mind, whether someone's come to an emergency through an awakened experience, or if it's happened spontaneously through something that doesn't itself look like it might have a spiritual start point, because I still feel that when someone's in that their energy feels very, very fractured and uncontrollable for them.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Catherine and Janet. We're now going to take a break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about the symptoms of spiritual emergency now that we've got a concrete definition of what it is.
Have you ever wondered what happens after death? Deep hypnosis opens up the most amazing soul memories of a spirit world that awaits us all. Follow the fascinating journey of 15 ordinary people in the book Exploring the Eternal Soul, who have been regressed beyond a past life into the afterlife.
The Past Life Regression Academy teaches hypnosis, past life regression, regression therapy, and Life Between Lives regression internationally. Hundreds of students have been through the Academy training programme and have successful practices. This is because of the amazing results they get and the referrals that come from it. For more information, see the Regression Academy website.
Hello, welcome back. We're joined by my guests, Catherine Lucas and Janet Trelaw, and we're talking about spiritual emergency. So, Catherine and Janet, can you please tell us what are some of the symptoms of spiritual emergency? Maybe Catherine can take this one first.
So, well, we've already touched on some of them a little bit. When I was talking about my experience in Egypt, for example, of the emotional roller coaster. If you think of the speed with which, when you're at the very top of that roller coaster before you drop down, that's part of the intensity, because you move from one emotional state, which is very often absolute terror, to then this kind of blissful sense of unbounded love, within minutes sometimes. So that's part of the intensity. There can be a lot of physical symptoms. And often if somebody tries kind of going to the doctor can't actually identify what these are. I mean, one thing that I experienced was a lot of vibrating in the body. And this is quite common, a kind of shaking or jerking or spasms. Now when I feel vibrating like that, I kind of, I welcome it, and I see that it's, there's something happening, something shifting at an energetic level. But for people who don't have a background at all, it can be quite scary. Why does my body feel as if it's kind of trembling and shaking and vibrating? So there's a lot that can happen physically. Also, and I think Janet touched on this earlier actually, where she could no longer tell the difference between her inner world and her outer world, or the realm of spirit and material realm. Those sorts of confusions are very typical, and I certainly experienced that to some extent as well. What else?
I don't know, Janet, maybe you can...
Those are some of the things that first come to mind. Yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks, Catherine. How about Janet? Would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, just as Catherine was saying really there, the symptoms that I was feeling were to do with this, which is reality, which is not. And it can be that people in that terror, in that fear, have these ongoing symptoms really of not knowing what to do, and then from that other symptoms can be produced, which is hard to tell if it's actually coming from spiritual emergency or coming from within, because of the shakes, the tremors and other things that go with it. So they're very personal to each person's experience, but I would more say that the symptoms you're often looking at is that they're very, very intense. The symptoms aren't mild, they're intense versions of anything they might be experiencing within an awakening.
Thanks, Janet. Catherine, when we spoke before, you did say that we could construe it very simply, putting something very complex in simple terms. We could construe two types of different spiritual emergencies. One is about going up, for example, with the Kundalini awakening, and the other one is about going down, which is about getting in touch with the deep night of the soul. Are there different symptoms with these?
Yes, I mean, a dark night of the soul. Dark night of the soul is very often associated with depression as well. It's a particularly dangerous type of spiritual emergency because of the danger of suicide. So, this is why we stress it's so important to get support and help. And, the dangers, the other type of spiritual emergency where the energies kind of go up more, which can be associated with maybe with psychotic type elements. The dangers there can be that people, because they're so in touch with the soul level, the spirit level, they can actually, they're in danger of hurting themselves. So, for example, me thinking that I could fly, a colleague actually told me that one time, he had to persuade somebody to not throw themselves off the top of a 10-story building, building, because they thought they could fly. And so these are the sorts of dangers that you can get with that type of spiritual emergency.
Okay, and with spiritual emergency, Janet and Catherine, if the energy is fracturing, does that mean all our shadow selves are coming up for us to actually see it, to see our shadow self and to do something about it? Can we construe spiritual emergency to be that?
Yes, it's very much a healing process. It's the potential, any wounding we're carrying, any trauma we're carrying, any, like you say, shadow material that we've repressed. It all comes kind of spewing out. The image that I like, the analogy is of a volcano where this stuff all erupts. But this is an opportunity to get in touch with it, and then we discover how much there is that needs healing. But I think that's a very fair way of looking at it.
And Janet, you agree with this, because I know you say that you see spiritual emergency as deeply transformative, offering the possibility of breakthrough rather than breakdown.
Yes, definitely. If you're thinking of the energy, or the way I see it, the way the energy is, all our parts of ourselves, our past lives, our shadow selves, our wounds, are normally tucked away, and when it's right for us, they start to come to the surface to work with. With an emergency state where the energy sort of fractures, just as Catherine says, like a volcano, what happens? I see it like a beating drum. You've suddenly got this reverberation that happens, and so the person suddenly becomes aware of all of this stuff coming up to the surface, but it's often spontaneous, and so it's hard to actually deal with and to even know what they're dealing with. But I truly believe that you have a chance to actually transform it, whether it's to stabilize it first and then work with it, but it's allowing you to actually know what your deep wounds and your shadow self is, so that you can help yourself in the future.
Right, thank you. Just coming back to your own experiences, Janet and Catherine. Janet, you said there was a time when your inner world and your outer world was colliding. And also with Catherine, you were saying, one of your symptoms was you were standing on the precipice, thinking that you can fly. So when someone is going through spiritual emergency, do they actually lose sense of reality?
Yes, most definitely. When you're in that very heightened crisis state, as you're not knowing what is reality, it is so important to have someone or people around you that can support you, that keep you in, when I call it the real world, the material world of the here and now. It's a bit like having a tent peg. It holds you here a little bit while you're going through it. And so the support is really necessary, because even in those extremes, you may have awareness within there of that one is more the natural reality than the other, but you may have times where you literally lose yourself completely in that other reality, and it's like you're actually gone completely from yourself. You'll come back, but having support around you can bring you back as well.
Right. And Catherine, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when I was in Egypt, and I was in touch with that part of us that is completely interconnected with all things, that reality in some respects is far more real than our ego-based reality. So you start getting into some quite kind of complex kind of conversations about what is reality. I think it's certainly fair to say that I lost touch for a few days when I was in Egypt with this mundane everyday reality, and I needed, like as Janet's saying, I needed people to be able to hold that for me until I came back. But this is where we really need to trust the process, that people do come back, and they don't necessarily need heavy duty medication or ending up in hospital, that if they just get the right support and the right holding, they come back, and with the possibility of transformation and healing.
So can I just say, if someone who's going through, a really extreme spiritual emergency and they lose touch of reality, how can we tell that they're going through spiritual emergency versus another type of mental health challenge that is possibly a bit more difficult to come back from? Maybe Catherine, you can take this one first.
Well, in some respects, what we've always said within the Spiritual Crisis Network is that trying to distinguish between mental health issues illness. I'm resistant to the word illness, really, but trying to distinguish between that and spiritual crisis is kind of the wrong question in some respects, because they're so intertwined. It's very difficult to separate them out. They kind of can go very much hand in hand. Basically, what we need to do is support the process of spiritual awakening, and also support, give people the level of holding they need. Now, the difficulty is that in our society, we have very few places where we can offer somebody the 24-hour care and holding that they need. And that's why so many people end up in psychiatric hospital. It's not that that's the best place for them necessarily. Although, don't get me wrong, hospital can be the best place at times for people, but it's just that we don't have safe houses. There has been, there's been work done on this, and there is more coming in terms of being able to offer people support, but without medicalizing it. But that's another huge area, really.
And Jatna, what do you think? How can we differentiate between spiritual emergency, or can we differentiate between spiritual emergency and other mental health challenges?
I would agree with Catherine that it's so complex, and more often than not, there's a combination of things that are going on. In terms of working with it, I think anyone that's offering support needs to be aware that the person gets the right support. So I will think that I'm not medically trained, and that there can also be certain diseases, infectious diseases, and other such things that could be causing issues. So I think there's very much the encouragement to still seek very good medical advice so that they can get all the support that's necessary. That's more my way of looking at it. But when I'm differentiating, the main thing I'm looking at is this person able enough to have that reasonable conversation with me to be able to explain their experiences, and have they got a level of spiritual content which there normally is in there as well, as a very simplified version.
Got it. Thank you.
This very well. He had a way of a table to look at different ways of looking at it, but that was then, and I know things have moved on, and Catherine's done a huge amount of work, of course, on this and how to differentiate it now in terms of the helpful aspects with people.
Because right now, coming back to what you were saying about going and seeking medical help as well, spiritual emergency was included in the DSM-4, wasn't it? And it's also now in the DSM-5. What is it categorized as?
It's categorized as a religious or spiritual problem. And that was quite a breakthrough when it was first included in the DSM-4. The main difficulty you have is that there's quite a mismatch between the medical professionals, who on the whole tend to not have a spiritual outlook on life. They're very kind of scientifically trained, very rationally, very kind of this very sort of kind of materialism kind of approach, and yet your average patient or client is much more likely to be open and aware of the spiritual. So you end up with this kind of mismatch, which can be quite tricky. I mean, there are psychiatrists that are more transpersonal and spiritually aware, and this is kind of like the new wave that we're starting to see, which is quite encouraging. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And so basically, I mean, DSM-4 and DSM-5 is a book that's basically used by psychiatrists in the medical world to diagnose various mental health challenges. So we can say with the inclusion of spiritual emergency within the DSM books, the medical fraternity are starting to accept spiritual emergency almost as a medical problem. Can we say that?
Yeah, they're kind of asking the wrong questions though, in the sense that they're still until they have more spiritual awareness themselves. Then they're still not going to. If you, for example, are getting flashbacks, say past life flashbacks, which could be very kind of visual in your mind's eye and quite kind of powerful. And if you have no understanding of past lives, very confusing. You would think that you were hallucinating and just that your mind was completely creating things. And of course, that's what your psychiatrist is also going to think if they have no sense of reincarnation. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky.
So what would you say to our viewers who are listening who have a slight suspicion they may be going through a spiritual emergency, but they don't quite know where to go with it? What would you say? Would you ask them to go and see a psychiatrist about it? What advice would you give them?
Well, certainly, I think Janet's advice about getting medical advice is important. What they need to do ideally is look for a transpersonal psychiatrist, a psychiatrist who has a spiritual awareness and understanding. Now, in the American health system, that's much easier than with the UK National Health Service, because we tend to kind of be allocated psychiatrists on depending on where we live on a geographical basis. So you don't have as much choice. And of course, there are not that many psychiatrists that have a spiritual awareness and understanding. So that's certainly one consideration. The Spiritual Crisis Network offers information and support by email, so they can contact the Spiritual Crisis Network. For most people, the first port of call is their GP, and again, they need to have a trust. They need to maybe have a sense of whether their GP is going to be open to the spiritual dimension or not.
Right. Okay. Janet, do you want to add anything to that?
Simply, really, that with this input onto the DSM, oh, I forgot the name of it, the DSMV, is just that, as my understanding, is that it gives people that do have the awareness, the psychiatrists that do have the awareness, to not always medicate. As far as I understood before, they almost didn't have a choice. If this was what was appearing, they had to use medication. So they do have the other route. And just as with the Regression Academy, we see a number of students coming through who are psychiatric nurses, and we've had doctors and surgeons, as you know, before, that I'm sure through many other ways, talking to the psychiatric nurses, what they're actually seeing, they're actually looking outside of what they can train in a very traditional way to bring in some information on this. So I'm very optimistic that this will start to spread across the board, and that even if it's just coming from an awareness within, that people can start being treated more on a personal, unique level rather than a labeling system with just what they're producing in their symptoms.
Right. I just wanted to ask you, what are the consequences of misunderstanding and almost diagnosing spiritual emergency to the person that's actually going through it? Maybe Janet, you can take this one first, and then we'll go to Catherine.
I think the real shame is the missed opportunity, because it will happen and it will go through its route that it's going to take, whatever, but it may take such a longer time, especially if medications are used, which can both open up someone's energy but also suppress other feelings. So they become almost a slight zombie-like state, or a state where it's bubbling at the surface but not having full expression. And then that can last for a long time, and the confusion can last for the person even longer, that they don't really understand what's actually happening. So it will happen at some stage, but it just takes so much longer than when it's looked at straight off, and some techniques and protocols and just the way of understanding and validating the experience can have the opportunity to come out and work through it.
Thanks, Janet. How about you, Catherine?
Yeah, well, Janet mentioned a crucial word there, validating, because that's what people need when they're going through this. They need their experience to be validated. If you don't do that, the opposite of that is pathologizing and telling somebody that they're ill, there's something wrong with them. And of course, this is what happened to me when I ended up in psychiatric hospital. It then took me 20 years. Janet was saying it would take a long time. It took me 20 years to come back kind of full circle and re-engage with the process in order to be able to move through to a kind of healing conclusion where I was able to kind of process it and integrate it. That gives you a sense of what can happen if you pathologize it rather than validating it. And of course, I then had the experience complete opposite in 2003 in Egypt and 2006, where it was validated. So I can see, I've felt personally the difference between being pathologized and being validated, and it's such a waste of human potential, and some people actually never really manage to re-engage with it. I was lucky because I consciously found my spiritual path. But some people just end up, we talk about the revolving door syndrome, where they end up in and out of psychiatric hospital all their lives and on fairly heavy duty medication for the rest of their lives. And yeah.
So what are some of the triggers and causes of spiritual emergency then?
Shall I take that first?
Yeah.
So, Stanislav Grof's wife, Christina, her spiritual emergency was triggered by childbirth. It can be triggered by, maybe first what we need to do is make a distinction. I think we sort of touched on this already, but let's clarify it a little bit. Basically, you can either have people who are kind of already on their spiritual journey, and so the trigger can be maybe an intensification of their spiritual practices, or they go on an intense silent meditation retreat, or some kind of personal spiritual development workshop. So those are kind of for people who are kind of already on their journeys. But for other people who are not, it can kind of seem like it's coming out of the blue. And it could be, like I mentioned, childbirth. It could be a bereavement. It could be a car accident. Basically, if the individual is ready, if there's a ripeness for transformation at the kind of psychic level, then virtually anything can trigger it. So for some people, it's intense sexual experiences can trigger it.
Right. Janet?
Yes, it's exactly that. The conditions are ripe. That's the main thing. And a lot of people do come to this through an awakening, whether it's shamanic, kundalini, whatever it might be that someone's actually working towards, as Catherine said. But you will also get these intense experiences where maybe the conditions were right, maybe there were stressful situations going on, and it's just one extra thing which just sends someone over the edge. But there normally is something that you can take it back to, where you can see where the awakening starts to turn into an emergency, or where something actually happens from it. But there can be many, many different situations that can bring rise to a crisis state.
Right, thanks, Janet. And I just wanted to ask you, Janet, prevention is better than cure. So if someone's going through a spiritual awakening, what can they do to prevent it from going into that crisis state? And if you can say this within a minute, that'll be great.
It's energy management. It's being aware. It's I tell people that if they're going to run a marathon, they're not going to just go out and do it. They need to have the right preparation so that they can make the most of the marathon and it doesn't break them in the process. And it's the same thing. If they embark on any form of awakening, whether it's through books and doing things at home, or even anything quite intense through retreats and workshops, as long as they are aware of their energy and that they are doing good energy management to make sure that they are safe, on the whole, it means that the awakening experience can go through without usually turning into a crisis, because that part hasn't been looked at.
Thanks, Janet. So how can viewers get in touch with Catherine if they wish more information about Spiritual Emergency?
Yeah, well, on my website, which is catherineglucas.com, there's my telephone number, email, Skype, all the details are on there. So that's catherineglucas.com.
And also, viewers can also look up Catherine's book, In Case of Spiritual Emergency, Moving Successfully Through Your Awakening. And Janet, how can people get in touch with you?
I tend to work just one-on-one with some people. So there is my website, which is planet-therapist.com. But I would certainly urge anybody to read Catherine's book, In Case of Spiritual Emergency, because it is so comprehensive almost before they do anything else.
Right. Thank you so much. Catherine, Janet, thank you so much for joining us today. We will be seeing you in our next show when we talk about how someone can move through spiritual emergency. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. For more information on Catherine, please visit catherineglucas.com. For more information on Janet Trelaw, please visit her website, planettherapies.com. For more information on the Past Life Regression Academy, please visit regressionacademy.com. And for more information on me, please visit divineaspect.com.
Healing the Eternal Soul is a book sprinkled with case examples that makes it an invaluable resource for those who assist others in achieving contact with their eternal part. It lends hope to those whose lives are stuck or riddled with painful residuals from past lives. More so, it's an incredibly interesting read.
The Past Life Regression Academy teaches hypnosis, past life regression, regression therapy, and life between lives regression internationally. Hundreds of students have been through the Academy training program and have successful practices. This is because of the amazing results they get and the referrals that come from it. For more information, see the Regression Academy website.